My name is Suzanne Nossel. I'm the CEO of PEN America. We're delighted to have you here with us tonight for our annual general meeting. This marks our first ever annual general meeting for PEN America on Zoom. In recent years, we've developed a tradition of bringing together writers and thinkers to talk about a pressing topic at this meeting. And while these discussions are normally limited to PEN America members, we're thrilled this year to have opened up the gates to all of you who are new to the organization and to offer you an introduction to what we do and what we think about here at PEN America. A word about PEN America membership. We are a community of writers, journalists, editors, publishers, readers, and allies who stand together to defend free speech, celebrate great literature, amplify lesser heard voices, and foster dialogue across divides. PEN America membership offers you the opportunity to stand up for writers here in the United States and around the world who take great risks to express themselves. If you're interested in exploring membership, please check out the links that my colleagues are popping into the chat box. And we're also so excited to welcome all of our members who are here with us tonight, joining from coast to coast. A quick housekeeping note, the chat is going to be kept open and we want to hear from you. We'll be sharing bios for our panelists and other relevant information as the night goes on. For questions, when we get to that time, we ask you to use the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen, and we will be bringing your questions into the conversation. It's now my great honor to introduce PEN America President Ayad Akhtar, who's going to begin the meeting with a few words about our organization and what we've been up to in these fraught times. Ayad is a novelist, playwright, winner of the 2013 Pulitzer Prize for Drama, and most recently the author of Homeland Elegies, which the Washington Post has called a tour de force. New York Times selected as one of its 10 best books of 2020, calling it pitch perfect and virtuosic. He joined the PEN America board in 2015. Please join me in welcoming Ayad.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you to the membership for electing me as your president. It's an honor to be taking over from Jennifer Egan, and I look forward to the tenure ahead. I'd just like to take a few minutes to reflect on what we've accomplished in the past few years and to cast a brief look at some of what might be ahead. As of late January 2021, with at least a portion of our national nightmare behind us, it's remarkable to reflect on just how much the past 4 years have shaped our organization. We've pushed relentlessly. So much of what we stand for was at stake. The kind of work we've done for almost 100 years on behalf of writers and truth tellers around the world was the kind of work that needed to be done here at home. PEN America took the unprecedented step of suing a sitting president, a president openly at war with the truth and with those who report it. In addition, we opened an office in Washington, D.C. to enable work with allies in legislation and policy. And in an effort to build bridges in a nation growing more and more fractured, we extended our reach, opening 6 chapters across America: Dallas, Austin, Greensboro, Detroit, Tulsa, and Birmingham. And we merged with what was a separate PEN organization in Los Angeles. In the process, we've grown significantly, more than doubling our annual budget, increasing membership, adding new programs. The active work of these past few years has helped PEN America become stronger, more visible, and more consequential. We're finding ways to meet the demands of rapidly changing times. Among the most pressing issues is widespread disinformation, as well as the collapse of local news. Both are having dramatic effects on our lives and our communities. What's more, one of our country's founding values, freedom of expression, is being tested in new ways online, with the rules as yet unwritten. In this complicated moment, PEN America aspires to be an informed, principled, non-doctrinaire voice, weighing in, clarifying, highlighting nuance, defending principle. As we plunge into a new political era, we expect to be focused on 4 areas. 1, helping to repair our broken information ecosystem. 2, drawing on writers to help bridge our societal divides. 3, continuing to dismantle barriers that prevent so many from having a voice. 4, reviving flagging faith in the bedrock value of freedom of expression. Finally, The importance of storytelling in the work of repair and reinvention ahead cannot be underestimated. Celebrating literature and its capacity to frame our understanding and transform our lives, this too is a vital part of our calling. Being a member of PEN America means being a part of a community that has united writers and their allies since 1922. It's a history going on a full century. You are all part of that history. Thank you for coming out tonight to support one another. We're in it together. Thank you for your passion and your commitment. And now for our featured conversation, I'd like to hand it back over to our Chief Executive Officer, Suzanne Nossel.
Thank you so much, Ayad. And while you were speaking, it was great to see everybody chiming in from across the country. I see someone from Canada joining us as well. So it's wonderful to have all of you here, almost 900 people and counting joining us. That counter keeps going up. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's discussion on the pressing question of whether and how we will force ourselves to reckon with the 4 years that we've all just lived through. It's not hard to imagine how the blissful silence of Donald Trump's stilled Twitter account could lull us into believing that all caps outrage is a thing of the past. It's like a blaring car alarm that finally got shut off. The sudden lifting of what felt like a perpetual state of national emergency offers the powerful temptation to believe that we now inhabit a country characterized by calm and confidence, a technicolor bouquet of inaugural fashions, a young poet laureate who told us we could be the light, and a fireworks display worthy of a country reborn. Except that it didn't take long for a resurgence of reminders that while the Trump administration is done, it isn't forgotten. 400,000 Americans dead of COVID and hundreds of thousands apparently still to come. Today, just 5 Republican senators breaking rank to support an impeachment trial. A third of the population still believing that the election was stolen. The last line of Ken Burns' bracing Civil War documentary is a reminder that that war is not over. A truth seared anew as we witness Confederate flags being used as battle rams at the Capitol a few weeks ago. Amid all this, and an impeachment trial that apparently will proceed despite today's vote, questions of accountability, reckoning, and reconciliation are existential for the nation. So before we launch in, we wanted to bring all of you into this, and we're going to put up a very quick poll that all of you should be able to answer, and hopefully that will pop up on your screen right now. It's just 2 questions, so take a quick look. First is, how important, if at all, do you think it is that we engage in some type of formal national process of reckoning and reconciliation after the Trump administration? And then the second question is, what is the most important element of such a process in your mind? And you can select up to 3. And this is just to get a sense of the folks who have joined us and what people think. And we'll share the results in a few minutes once they're all tabulated. So with that, I want to introduce our panel and begin to get our discussion going. I'm going to do this briefly. You have our panelists' bios in a link in the chat. You can see each one of these panelists is incredibly distinguished and accomplished. So we would be here for quite some time if we were going to recount that properly. So I'm going to keep it quick and get right to the discussion that I know you've all come to hear. We have with us, alongside Ayad, National Book Award winning author Masha Gessen, Harvard history professor Jill Lepore, Wall Street Journal opinion writer Peggy Noonan, New York Times columnist Charles Blow, whose book, The Devil You Know, A Black Power Manifesto, is out just today. This is his pub day, so congratulations, Charles. He's very well branded. And finally, Bard College professor Omar Encarnacion. And their full bios are on the website, and I urge you to take a look after the discussion. I'm just waiting for okay, I think I can go forward. I'm going to start with you, Masha. Masha was in many ways the inspiration for this discussion with a piece that they wrote in the New Yorker making a compelling case that we face a real fork in the road here, a choice between, as you put it, the path of reckoning and the path of forgetting. And you offer us the stark example of Russia, where the repression and ravages of the Soviet Union have for many been obscured by a glorifying gaze of resurgent nostalgia. In your mind, what do we need to do to make certain that no one looks back on the Trump era with longing, and that future strongmen are not able to appeal to a sense of longing for what has been lost? What sort of process or initiative, and by whom, would get us closest to guaranteeing that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer all of that question, but I'll share what I've been thinking about. And I should say that, obviously Russia is not the best the best comparison to. I think somebody has their mic on. I'm hearing myself in my ears. It's just Russia happens to be the country that I know best, and also a country that has faced some really difficult choices where it comes to memory and reckoning, and has basically pretty much at every point chosen to let sleeping dogs lie, to sweep things under the rug, partly out of a sense that, a very real sense that it was just impossible, that what was required in order to have a national conversation about the past and about the way about the crimes that were committed, but also about the way that families were split into ideologically opposite camps, about the way that in one family you would have victims and perpetrators at the same time, that was just unbearable. It was just impossible. It could never happen. And so it was better to pretend that it had never happened. And well, it hasn't worked out well for Russia. And this is the part that I think is generalizable, right? That I think that in general, when we decide that a festering wound is best left untended, it doesn't end well, right? Whether it's a physical wound or a psychic wound, unless we do the work that will somehow attempt to cure it, to heal it, the healing will not happen. And I think that runs against a sort of American political tradition and intuition, right? Where we almost assume that the right thing to do, the magnanimous thing to do, is for the incoming president to say, okay, well, that's in the past, let's move on. And I think what we're watching the last few days, certainly since President Biden was inaugurated, is a kind of cynical weaponizing of that culture of moving on by the Republican Party, right, which invokes divisiveness at the least provocation, and a lack of resolve on the Democrats' part to push for what I think is necessary, which brings me to what I think is necessary. What I think is necessary is a national storytelling project. And I think there are many possible ways to do this. This is where I get sort of to vague imaginings, but I think we have. I think what's important, and this we know from societies that have dealt with collective trauma somewhat more effectively, right? We know that narrative approaches are super important, and we know that rituals are very important. Right? So, for example, when we talk about the impeachment trial in the Senate, I think it's useful to talk about the impeachment trial as a narrative forming exercise, as a truth-finding mission, not the way that we normally in this country think about trials, which is determine measure of guilt, apportion appropriate punishment. There are cultures, and I think this is a moment when we need to borrow from them, that think of trials as truth-finding missions and as storytelling. And I think that what we need to try to emerge from the Senate trial with is a story, but that's one of many stories, right? In my wildest dreams, I imagine a huge PEN America project that sends writers, once we can do this, to public libraries all over the country, and we have like these gatherings where we tell stories, right? Tell stories of these of the communities where we're, tell stories about how these communities coped with the last 4 years and earlier, right? How they were wounded and how they weren't, but also to even more importantly, what they are and what they can be. Because ultimately, and this is where I get to nostalgia, ultimately a storytelling project like that is about creating a national vision of the future, which is the ultimate antidote to a demagogue like Trump, or like pretty much any other autocrat we have known in the fairly recent past, but also in some parts of the 20th century, which are nostalgia-driven autocrats, right? People who promise to transport the country to an imaginary past when they weren't comfortable, when they weren't threatened, when they didn't feel overwhelming anxiety. And I think that what we need to argue with that is a vision of a glorious future, which is the final goal of that kind of storytelling exercise. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I want to turn next to Jill, and you make, and we're putting the relevant pieces into the chat so people can read them afterwards if you haven't yet, but you make a quite different argument about the role of our democratic institutions and a case that they must be center stage, that the Trump administration, as you put, is not Nazi Germany, nor is it a nation defeated in war. Its wrongdoing should be investigated by journalists, chronicled by historians, and in some instances, tried in ordinary courts. And you argue, I think, that a kind of truth and reconciliation process, someone mentioned South Africa in the chat, would risk detracting from that. You also, just going directly to what Masha was sort of sketching out her vision, you say, even though the argument about what it means and what should happen will be bitter and the divisions in America will not be eased, at least there will be a shared narrative and facts, some people argue, but you say this is a fantasy. And I want to sort of spool that out and get to, what you think is at stake for the institutions that have roles to play, in this period, be that the Senate or the courts or our prosecutors or our media and our historians, and whether and how kind of narrative fits in. Can those processes ever satisfy the sort of storytelling impulses and purposes that Masha was outlining?
Sure. Well, first, let me just say it's a real honor to be on the panel, and also an honor to be part of PEN, which is doing such important work and imagining such important work in the future as well. I guess I would begin by endorsing Masha's vision for a national storytelling project, which is something that a lot of people have been arguing for a long time, something that could take the form, for instance, of the Federal Writers Project from the 1930s, or the projects of photography and other kinds of documentary populism from the 1930s that met all kinds of different purposes, but among them amounted to, and I'm sure this is, I don't want to speak for Masha, but like the other half of a storytelling project is a story listening project, right? It's the listening that really matters. Like we can have people tell beautiful stories, we have to be willing to listen to one another. And that in the history of those kinds of projects, the 1930s projects, for all their many, many flaws and forms of provincialism and prejudice, had the capacity to help people understand their shared suffering, and gave people compassion for what it meant to suffer in different kinds of ways. And I think that's where I might maybe want to pull apart what I think might be two impulses in this political moment, one of which is to undertake a legal or procedural or political or is, in your terms, narrative reckoning with the last 4 years of the Trump administration. And then there's in my mind, a much bigger project, which has to do with, understanding American history, and particular racial injustice. And I think there are ways where the Truth and Reconciliation Commission model obtains. Like, I think there are proposals on the table for various Truth and Reconciliation Commission structures to bring out and to collect evidence regarding Indigenous people. So sort of the forced boarding school stories that have not been told to the public, that the public does not see. I think people who have argued for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission on race and racial injustice in American history there are traditions that they are drawing on, for which the work of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is to build a body of evidence and assemble it and collect it, and allow people to tell their stories for purposes of chronicling and healing. Those make a lot of sense. That's, to my mind, different question of what happens to ex-Trump officials. What do we think about impeachment? What do we think about prosecutions? One of the reasons that I have argued against the idea that there should be some kind of a Trump era Truth and Reconciliation Commission is that the bargain in a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is amnesty in exchange for truth, right? So if you pursue that model, that's because you've decided you're not going to prosecute anybody. And those are the terms under which people come forward to tell their stories, because no one will be prosecuted. I think there are people in the Trump administration who should be prosecuted. Like, I wouldn't foreclose that option. And I guess I'd add, like, the series of institutions that have and practices and rituals that have evolved over the years that are part of the American political tradition involve the reckoning of political disagreement through an election, which is a verdict, which is an attempt to kind of discover the truth. Like, who does the electorate believe is the best carrier forward of the country's governance? And the way people reconcile themselves to an election is through the peaceful transfer of power. So we've lost that tradition, or that tradition has been shown to be unbelievably fragile, terrifyingly fragile. And that's why the models of what's called transitional justice would seem to apply, because in a democratic society, you don't need recourse to these other measures and divide.
I think we've lost Jill. Can everyone else still hear me? Panelists nod? Yes, okay. Jill, are you back? We lost you for a second there.
I can hear you. Can you not hear me?
We can hear you now. So maybe just finish up. Hopefully the connection is okay.
Sure, I'll just finish up, which is just to say, I think we're in unknown terrain here in terms of what the mechanisms are for delivering justice and relieving suffering. And I think what's tricky is that for many people, I think people in the Biden administration think the choice in the immediate term is between relieving suffering and delivering justice. There are those who will say, and some panelists will say, that's not a choice, that's a false choice.
Okay, I want to go over, I'm going to come back to a number of things that you brought up, but I want to go to Peggy next and sort of thinking back, Peggy, to the Nixon era. What you had then, even with all the divisiveness over the pardon of Nixon, at the time that he left office, even his closest allies had turned on him. James Kilpatrick, perhaps his strongest defender in the media, saying, berating himself for failing to realize Nixon was a liar. Goldwater and the two ranking Republicans in the Congress, demarched to the president to tell him he was finished. And 3 weeks ago, right after the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol, it sort of seemed like we might possibly be on the verge of that sort of tipping point, and that politicians who had somehow managed to look the other way for 4 or 5 years, were suddenly running and hiding for their lives. And it was brought, the reality of this was brought home to them in a way, it sort of felt, finally they can't ignore, the equivalent of the shooting on Fifth Avenue that former President Trump always knew he could get away with. And yet it seems so quickly things have tilted back in the other direction. And, as of tonight, prospects for a conviction in an impeachment trial look bleak. And, to Masha's point that such a trial, is in part a storytelling exercise, I think we have to wonder and perhaps worry about what story will be told and what story will be heard. And I'm curious what you think about this concern with ensuring that history doesn't grow nostalgic for the Trump era. Are we not kind of highly exposed right now to that risk, and what should we do about it? Unmute, Peggy, sorry, you're still on mute. Uh-oh. There you go.
I am unmuted. I beg your pardon. I do have a thought on Nixon and Watergate here, but I want to start with this. I mean this very seriously. I just want to thank you for including me and inviting me tonight. I admire Penn's mission, its longtime mission since the 1920s, a great deal. I think as words go, there are few greater than the three that state what you were invented to support, and that is free human expression, which in a way is part of what we're talking about tonight. Look, you mean to unite writers and their allies. I can't think of a better and more important mission. So thank you, and it's good to be here. On the questions of reconciliation and reckoning in the post-Trump era, these are my thoughts. I think in democracies, things get reconciled over time. This happens through consensus rising, sometimes slowly, usually sort of gradually, but inevitably. This happened. I remember it. I was in college. I was, I think, in my sophomore year in college when Richard Nixon fell. But it happened with Nixon and Watergate. Nixon still had significant support when he resigned the presidency in 1974. And the Watergate scandal at that time was still a matter of considerable controversy. But in time and over time, that changed. Consensus emerged, and people just sort of year by year, the farther they got from the event, the more they agreed that was awful. Watergate was a scandal. It was marked by terrible behavior, and let's not ever let that happen again, or let's not do that again. So I think consensus rises. The great reconciler, I think, is free speech. It's that simple. Things get reconciled through writing. And as we've been saying, storytelling and persuasion and taking a public side and arguing for your point of view and bringing ignored or unknown facts and data to light. Time has a role. You see some things more clearly with time. So does perspective. When you're standing in the middle of a mountain halfway up a climb, it looks like it's all mud and rocks. But if you travel 10 miles away from the mountain and look back, you can see how truly massive it is and how it totally changed the landscape. So for the idea of reconciliation in historical events and personal relations, I would say rely as much as possible on free human expression from writers and thinkers and their allies. Reckoning, on the other hand, I think implies something more immediate. Politics in America is not a a directly reconciling activity. It is an arguing activity. It is a fight. It seems to me a reckoning is happening already, has happened pretty quickly. It's happening rather vividly. The Trump era ended, I think we all agree, in shame, in one branch of the federal government essentially directing a mob to violently attack another branch in an attempt, I'm still amazed to say this, to thwart the peaceful transfer of presidential power, which is mandated in the Constitution. But there has been a quickly formed national feeling about this to move hard and with speed against all those responsible. Last night, the bill of impeachment, as you know, was walked over to the House from the US Senate. There will be a trial of the former president and yet more evidence of the insurrection, its planning and participants will be presented. Donald Trump has been impeached by the House already. The third ranking Republican there lambasted him and voted to impeach. Agencies of the US government have gone after the rioters, identifying them, tracking them down, arresting them. The two senators who led the movement in the Senate to reject the certified decisions of the Electoral College have been shamed. And one, Josh Hawley of Missouri, has seen his approval numbers in his home state plummet. This is all part of a democratic reckoning, and I say it is good. The president himself is slunked off to Mar-a-Lago, silent, brooding, and ridiculous. We'll see in what form he comes back, if any, to what degree. I see him personally as a spent force. We'll see if that is correct. So I believe, in short, reckoning will happen and is happening. Reconciliation is to be desired, obviously. But I think trust our institutions, as Jill said, and protect free speech. I think it's not a question of forgetting on the one hand or having a formal process on the other. I think it's a matter of reflecting, coming to agreement, quietly admitting, this is what I think, this is what I think, this is what I think is true. I love the story. I love the idea of storytelling. I personally can't get enough of the WPA and its Writers Project. So I think that is all good, but I think you have to go into it knowing and being open to and accepting the fact that you will have about 81 million stories of one kind and about 75 million stories of another, and they will be different stories. And you have to be open, and as someone said, you don't just talk and tell, you also have to listen. It's always true in life and in history. That's all.
Thank you, Peggy. Thanks very much. Charles, I want to turn to you next, and I have a question for you, but I also want to hear your reaction to some of what Peggy said. You sort of tackled this topic, from the perspective of the victims, people who were demeaned, degraded, deported, separated from their families over the last few years. And obviously there are sighs of relief and there are things to celebrate right now in terms of the things the new administration is doing every day on immigrants' rights, transgender rights, racial justice, what the cabinet looks like, our new vice president. And I'm curious how you think about the interplay between that forward progress to redress societal ills and a deliberate effort at reckoning and reconciliation, which is more backward looking inherently. I also, just to build on Peggy's comment, I'm very curious how you react to her notion that there is a sort of gradual, inevitable rising of consensus that kind of, we can count on coming about and sort of bringing us to the right place when it comes to understanding our past. Because you have argued so powerfully in your work that that has really never happened when it comes to racial inequity and injustice in this country, that we've never come around to that consensus, and that the failure to do so has thwarted our founding purposes in so many ways. So is there anything to what she's saying? Are we moving toward some kind of reconciliation like that, or is that the wrong way to think about it? And can we, is that sort of the fundamental error to assume that that's sort of naturally and inherently going to happen?
No, I think the inverse is true, which is that there's actually always been consensus. It was just that it was a consensus against people who were not white. That the consensus was that it was okay to hold up white supremacy. That either you were an active participant in that or you were quietly letting it happen. That was the consensus of white America, and remains the consensus to some degree. And that is why the word reconciliation is problematic in this conversation, because it suggests a restoration of something. And what are you restoring that would be unifying and healing for Black people or Hispanic people or even Asian people or Native Americans? To what year would you dial that back where it was great? Mass incarceration grew before Trump was in office. Trayvon Martin was killed 15 years ago. Tamir Rice was killed 7 years ago. Hyper-militarized policing occurred before Donald Trump. What are we restoring? To what marker? The problem here is that, even this idea of a story, national story project, which is great, but as Jill mentioned before, we did it. In the 1930s, we did it. A part of that project was the slave narratives. And we still got, after that, racial covenants that sprang up in city after city across America that prevented Black people from owning property in those cities. We still got redlining. Jim Crow continued to flourish for another 30 years in the South. There's just a limitation, because what we labor under the delusion that we can educate people out of that kind of oppressive impulse, as if it were not done in the full light of day. For this book, I spent months reading the minutes of the state constitutions from the 1890 on, where state after state held constitutional conventions to explicitly, and it's shocking to read in the minutes, explicitly to write white supremacy into the code of each one of those states, state after state after state after state. These weren't rednecks on the back of pickup trucks with hoods over their heads. These were ministers. These were mayors. These were politicians. This was not done in the dark of night. It did not start with Donald Trump. We know that it was done. We know who benefits from it. We know who did it. So what does reconciliation look like? What would a Truth and Reconciliation Council provide for us? Who's going to be telling those truths and who's going to be listening to them? Because what we have seen over and over is that the power structures don't want to shift at all. And that is not just conservatives, that is white liberals too. When stop and frisk was ravaging through Black and brown communities, picking up children in New York City. Never forget that Michael Bloomberg said 16 was his young age. These were not adults, they were children. They had done nothing wrong. And every year that Quinnipiac asked the citizens of New York City if they agreed with stop and frisk or not, the majority of white people in New York City said they were perfectly okay with it. No one is interested in dismantling these structures, including liberals. And that is the problem. There is a consensus and has always been a consensus. And it has been arrayed against people who were not white.
Thank you, Charles. Yeah, I don't necessarily think of the word reconciliation as implying, kind of a reset to a time past, but more as, some kind of bridging and catharsis to get past, to get beyond divisions. I mean, that doesn't mean, it doesn't make any of what you talk about any more tractable, but I'd be interested in what others, what sort of how, when we do use these terms, how we use them. I'm going to turn next to Omar, who is going to offer us some international perspective, as many people have touched on in the chat. But there are international examples of societies, and Masha touched on this, that have gone through these processes. None is quite like our own, although some seem to have similar impulses, whether that's racial repression or a compulsion to forget, or an affinity for certain kinds of strong men. And I'm curious, Omar, in this moment, living here, what you think we can learn from your expertise with how these situations have been handled in Spain, Argentina, and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you for the invitation, which I was happy to accept. So my work deals with truth, reconciliation, and justice, particularly in the context of post-Franco Spain and also post-military rule Argentina, or post-authoritarian Argentina. So let me just make a few broad comments about reconciliation as it sort of developed as an academic field, but also as a policy process. And then I'll get to the questions about what we could learn from those experiences. Truth commissions began in the mid-70s in all places in Uganda to look into the political disappearances of the foes of the Idi Amin regime, but they only gained international renown in South America in the 1980s, especially in Argentina, which convened a landmark commission to look into the political excesses of the so-called dirty war. That commission, I think, is worth noting because it relates to a point that Jill made. I think most Americans, when they think of Truth Commission, they think of South Africa, which in fact contained that controversial trade-off between truth and justice. But that was not the case of Argentina. Argentina did not give amnesty to the military. And in fact, the commission's report, Nunca Más, Never Again, became the basis for putting the military on trial. So it's important to note that even though I think most of us tend to focus on South Africa as sort of the key case here, the experience of the Truth Commission is much broader. And in fact, there's no sort of monolithic commission. They can do many things, but it's important to note that convening a Truth Commission does not preclude the possibility of prosecution. Beyond that, it is important to know that Truth Commissions are not the exclusive province of poor developing post-authoritarian societies. Germany did want to look into the legacy of communism. Canada did want to look into the treatment of indigenous peoples. Korea did one on the Japanese occupation of the Korean Peninsula. So we're looking at countries that are now rich, modern, availing themselves of Truth Commissions to explore a variety of factors and situations. The other point, which relates to the broad range of subjects which are now being incorporated into Truth Commissions. The last one, which I paid attention to, was that of Brazil, which was concluded in 2014. That was the last country in South America to convene a Truth Commission. And one of the virtues having waited for that commission is that it was the first in the world to incorporate violations of human rights against LGBTQ people. And that is a rare incorporation of that particular subject into Truth Commissions. You might recall, and if not, I urge you to go online and view when that report was handed to Dilma Rousseff, the president of Brazil. She herself was the victim of torture of the military, and she grew incredibly emotional upon being able to actually see firsthand the fruit of that report. Beyond that, I should also note that the US has been a great sponsor of truth commissions all over the world. And in fact, at some point, it has used the commissions often in a sort of imperialistic mode. And we should be aware of this. In some cases, it has actually forced countries to conduct trials. That was the case in Iraq. It's also the case in Afghanistan. I have written against this because I don't believe that we ought to tell what countries ought to do when it comes to the past. I believe that in many ways, it should be a reflection of whatever is happening within that society. And finally, let me touch on the issue of lessons. I think I sort of touched on some, but I want to be more precise with respect to truth, with respect to justice, and then reconciliation. On the issue of truth, I think, and this actually goes for all three factors, we need to lower expectations as to what commissions can do with respect to all three. With respect to the truth, it's important to note that truth commissions are not fact-finding missions in the way that most people would imagine them to be. They are primarily vehicles for voicing the concerns of victims. And in many cases, one often hears complaints that truth commissions have a problem with the truth, primarily because they convey a particular point of view, one primarily that comes from the victim's perspective, and that's important to note. The other point, which I think Jill brought up, is the fact that in some cases you do have to compromise on justice in order to get to the truth. That was the case in South Africa, where by the way, they learned this from the Argentines. They learned from Argentina that the only way you can get to the truth is by actually giving amnesty to those who committed the transgression. So clearly there's something of a trade-off here. But again, it's important to note that when it comes to truth, there might be problems in how the truth is finally conceived. With respect to justice, do remember that a truth commission is a non-judicial body. So one cannot expect that automatically the final report would lead to an indictment or would lead to throw anyone in jail. They are a narrative that is meant to convey a so-called official history, but it is not technically speaking a legal document, nor again should we expect that to lead to prosecutions. With respect to reconciliation, I think that the bigger point I can make about this, I think there's often an illusion that a truth commission would lead to some sort of a consensus about the truth. And that I think we need to dispense of fairly easily. That is not the case. I think the only cases in which one can imagine this being the case is in those cases where there's already a consensus about what had transpired in the past. I think the case of Argentina is a good example of that. It was quite clear in the mid-'80s that the country had endured a horrendous experience at the hands of the military. And there was great desire by the Argentines to see them punished and to see the truth fully revealed. But that's not the case in many countries. And in fact, in some countries, they have purposely avoided a truth commission for the sake of guaranteeing the peace. And the best example of this, which I've written extensively about, is the case of post-Franco Spain. Spain, many people think, should have a truth commission, yet there has never been a truth commission to examine the horrors of the Spanish Civil War. In fact, there's not even a monument in Spain to the victims of the war. By the way, they also never held any trials against the members of that regime. If you look into the case very carefully, you will find that there was a concerted effort to avoid confrontation after Franco died, and to avoid any kind of recrimination as to who was ultimately to blame for the war, even though the record is quite clear that the nationalist side was the one responsible for the war. That is not to say, however, that there has not been some degree of reconciliation or even truth-telling in Spain. If you look at the law that was enacted in 2007, the law of historical memory, that law declared the Franco regime illegitimate. It granted citizenship to the heirs of the Spanish, the so-called Republican exile, those who fled to other parts of Europe and Latin America. It demanded, and in fact, finally got the removal of all public monuments to Franco from the Spanish territories. And then it opened a center in the city of Salamanca for the start of the Civil War. So there are all kinds of ways to get a reconciliation, but the larger point I'm making is that we ought to be very careful in building expectations about what this will do, particularly with respect to consensus. It is not always the case that this leads to that. In some cases, it might be better off to seek other venues through which to build that consensus. And finally, going back to the case of Spain, if you look at my book carefully, you would see that there is actually an argument there for forgetting. And many have argued very extensively about the virtues of somehow bringing some degree of not quite oblivion, the Spaniards speak about a pact of forgetting, which implies that we learn from the past, but then somehow move on. So that's always worthy to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. Okay, it's going to be over to Ayad. And Ayad, you're someone in your own work who focuses on storytelling that does interrogate collective trauma, whether it's 9/11 or the crash of the stock market or the experience of the Muslim American experience and Islamophobia. And I'm curious sort of what, how far do you think that goes? I know there hasn't been, everyone loves your Homeland Elegies, but there hasn't been consensus about a lot of your work. And I think, the purpose of your work in some ways is to spark that debate. And so I'm wondering how you see the role of the writer, the playwright sort of fitting into this. And if we do have a national project of reconciliation or reckoning, formally or informally, what is the role of the writer within that?
Thanks, Suzanne. Thanks for that. And such an honor to be here with this amazing group of panelists. I'm inspired by Masha's proposition of a national storytelling project, and I would sign on to be a listener to all of that. I think, the process of hearing people bear witness could be really productive. Synthesizing all of that witness bearing into a larger analytical approach or an understanding of what has happened is probably something that's going to take time. It seems to me that in my work, while I have been writing about 9/11 in various ways for a long time, it really is only recently that I think there's been an openness to really exploring more than the expression of grief around 9/11. And I'm not sure that the process of whatever truth and reconciliation or whatever national healing, if we will ever get there around 9/11, is ultimately about grieving. I don't think it's about grieving. I think it's about understanding, to take a page out of classical dramaturgy, how we ourselves are somehow implicated in what happened to us. That's to get to that level of understanding, which I think artists can do, and great historians like Thucydides and others are able to synthesize all of that witness bearing into something larger. That I think is going to take time, but I do think artists have a role to play. In the case of the Trump era, I wonder what the question really is. The malfeasance is so extraordinary, and it seems to represent something much bigger about our own national character in a way, both a test of it, but also an expression of it. And I'm not sure that even a very compelling portrait of Trump as ultimate antagonist to the American project is really what we're talking about. I think we're talking about something deeper, and I think that may take time.
Okay, thank you. I want to encourage people, if you have a specific question, to put it in the Q&A tab. And I feel like some people are sharing kind of rhetorical questions that are thought-provoking, and we'll definitely pose some of them to the panelists. I kind of want to come back to this discussion between Peggy and Charles, and sort of I think there's something that we are all struggling with as a society in terms of the incredibly stubborn legacy and present day reality of racism and the grip that it holds on us. And, I think for many people that kind of came alive in a new way last summer in relation to police abuses and the movement for racial justice. And I think on January 6th as well, and in the context of the effort to overturn the election and particularly to deny the results in states and cities with majority Black populations or significant Black electorates. And I'm curious, Peggy, sort of how you respond to that. And I think you offered sort of a kind of an optimistic notion that we kind of gradually come around and get these things right and sort of see clearly. And I think Charles is sort of really challenging that and saying, actually, to the extent that we've ever done that, what has been seen is through a white supremacist lens. And I'm curious, how do you interpret that and make sense of it? How does it square with kind of your experience and your outlook on these things. I think you're still mute, although it doesn't look like.
Am I?
Yeah, now we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay.
Thank
I'm not really sure what to say. I think optimism and hope and a certain amount of faith are helpful attitudes. But I also think some problems last a really long time, and you've got to sit and say, what can we do to make it better? What can we do to heal it? What can we do to stop this daily grinding wound? I think the American people are desperate in their own way to heal their divisions. And I think at this point, they're just not sure what to do.
And Charles, to go back to you for a minute, you know, this administration, at least from what I can see, does seem profoundly committed to addressing some of these issues in ways that we haven't seen. I mean, the decision today to end relationships with private prisons, you know, is pretty monumental. And I think there's more that's already been done and a lot more to come. And curious sort of how you see, there's that, and then there's also, you know, what we as a society have been doing. My last trip before the pandemic set in was to the South in Montgomery and seeing the National Museum of Lynching there, that it, you know, it is an incredibly powerful place of memory and reckoning. And I'm curious, like, do you sort of feel like some combination of policy and culture is ultimately what's going to drive us forward, or how you and how do you see progress on these issues? I think you're still mute.
I will say up front, I do not like the progress argument, because the progress argument ignores this fact. This is a thing that should never have been done. We created this caste system of slavery, of racism in America, gave it our own character in this country, should never have been done. So the centuries-long crawling out of the cave is not something I'm going to pat people on the back for. If it's going to take centuries to bring me back to zero, to the level, that kind of progress is taking too long. That's my great-grandfather waited for that. The grandfather waited for that. The mother waited for that. You want us to have faith in a time which we don't even know what the date would be on this ultimate liberation. Maybe it's in my lifetime, maybe it's in my kids, or maybe it's in their kids. But I'm supposed to revel in the fact that you're inching forward to undo a thing that should never, ever have been done. That is the first problem here. When Martin Luther King was in Birmingham jail and wrote that the white moderate lives by the myth of time, he's talking about the idea that you think we have that time. You think we are willing to wait. And it's a waiting that only we have to shoulder. How could that possibly be fair to anyone who has to wait under that? How could that be fair to me when I walk through a graveyard and I see generation after generation and I'm thinking, I'm still writing about struggle that person lived through? What is that supposed to mean to us? What is this faith supposed to be put into? This idea that we're going to have to find a way to talk and work it out. What is there to work out? It is the simplest thing to say that all people are created equally. There is no hierarchy to humanity. that everybody deserves an equal shot, that no one deserves to be oppressed or profiled. Why is that such a hard thing for us to say as human beings? And why should I be hopeful about people saying it's going to take me a while to get there? What does that mean to me?
Thank you. Jill, I want to turn to you as sort of the U.S. historian in the conversation, and just ask how you think about. We so often talk about, and I feel like this phrase has become more foregrounded. The more perfect union. We had an event with President Obama a few weeks ago, and he was sort of just talking about this idea of the more perfect union and progress, and Joe Biden talks about possibility. And I think it's quite ingrained, and I'm wondering sort of how you respond to kind of the critique of progress that Charles has brought up, and whether you see is there sort of a different way of thinking about this that might be more satisfying for those who make his point, which is why should we still be waiting for progress and this kind of very slow inching forward movement, if any?
Well, I think, right, the argument, the critique of progress is that we need revolution now, right? Like that has been the indictment of the left, of liberals, since the 1820s. You can see that debate taking place among the incredibly powerful Black abolitionists in the North, who were deeply dissatisfied with white abolitionists and their kind of sort of a version of the white liberals that King was indicting in the letter from the Birmingham jail, right? Like, well, just be patient, we'll get there. It's only 1826, right? So, what Charles is describing as that, I mean, everyone here is a historian, right? Everyone in the audience is a historian. We have lived through history. Everyone here are people who've thought about the nature of change over time. So I wouldn't necessarily put myself as having some particularly distinct vantage on the nature of that process. But I would say, I would reflect on the question in this way. I wrote a history of the United States a few years ago, and when I was almost done, well, I was more than halfway done writing the book, Trump was elected. And so at the last minute, I kind of had to tag on like a last chapter that kind of went, I was going to end the book with Obama's inauguration. And then I decided I would end it with Trump's election in November of 2016. And when people read the book, like the single most prevalent comment I got about the book was, oh my God, how did you write this 1,000-page history of the United States so quickly, and you must have waited and not even begun until Trump was elected, because every page of the book explains Trump's rise. Like, because the book is centrally concerned, as American history must be, with matters of race and racial injustice and the nature of white supremacy, the book seemed like as if I'd waited, and I wrote the whole thing in a month to these readers. And we have this conversation, I said, but that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, like she could have been the president, like history's contingent. In that same book, if someone else had won the election, or if the United States had moved in a different direction, or if the book had ended with Obama's inauguration day in January of 2009, they would have read all the debates about race just differently, because they would have heard the resonances of kind of where we are now. And this is one of the things that's, I was really so struck by what Omar had to say about what Truth and Reconciliation Commissions can do and what they can't do, and kind of managing expectations. Because historians think about time in the immediate, the intermediate, and in a distant way. And we have a very different vantage on change over time when we're in the midst of a great deal of tumult. I think we're very much in an immediate experience of historic change. We haven't talked at all this evening about the pandemic and the degree to which that gives people a sense that we are moving backwards in time, right? We are living in a way that doesn't feel like our lifetimes somehow. I think that for Black Americans, that experience is a kind of daily, every year. How are we still, you know, Charles talking about going to the grave, how am I still witnessing the kind of suffering that my great grandfather witnessed and fought against, right? I think that we all start the kind of like the rich are basically eating the poor at this point. Like we are living in such grotesque inequality that the idea that we could kind of come together without confronting the kind of deep reckoning with injustice that Charles is urging upon us about race here, that is the necessary speech, right? Like that is the act of expression that needs to happen. The question I think that Suzanne, you wanted us to engage with is, okay, what happens then next?
We have a question from Ella Javeri saying, I've not heard of people from Trump supporting friends that they want to heal and accept what has happened. I find them angry that they were cheated. I'm curious, Masha and Ayad, both people in your work, you've sort of thought a lot about these populations that don't want to be part of a forward-looking or reconciliatory process, don't want to reckon with abuses and wrongdoing and injustice, and are invested in something very different. And I'm curious, so what do you make of this population in this country? I think there's been a debate for many years about, I remember in 2016, do you sort of spend more time engaging with these people? Do you spend no time at all engaging with these people? How do we think about that now, Masha?
Yeah, I don't know that that's the question. So let me try to answer questions that I think may be useful. Like, what do we do living in a country where a very large minority of people, nearly half the population, seems to be inhabiting a reality that doesn't overlap with the fact-based reality of a slight majority, right? And I think we do two things fundamentally. I think we try to address the very real and well-founded anxieties that lead to that escape from reality, right? And this is not the sort of, go to the diner and be condescending kind of narrative. It is the understanding that, what we know about autocracies going back now a century is that they take root in times of extreme economic and social anxiety and displacement of people, right? And so that's something that we need to address. And I think that that the preconditions for Trumpism were laid by not addressing those anxieties quite consistently. But the other thing that we need to do is we need to address the structural conditions that make it possible for people to exist in entirely different realities. And those conditions involve, for one thing, the disappearance of local media, and more broadly, the fact that we leave our public sphere, what we call the fourth branch of government, what we think of as essential for democracy, to a bunch of unregulated profit-making corporations, and somehow keep hoping that it will work out okay, which it won't. And so, we have to engage with these two huge things before we start talking about whether we're engaging with the people who are living in those conditions.
Yeah.
Well, just to pick up some of the stuff that Masha was talking about, if I was to speak specifically about a place that I know quite well, which is Wisconsin, and watching the changes that have happened in the state over the last 20 years, say, the deteriorating economic conditions and the deteriorating, the sort of the flight of money from the heartland of the state to the larger cities, and by extension from the state itself to the coasts. It's it's the underlying condition for the dissension that has descended, that has overtaken the politics of the state. And until we are serious about wanting to address fundamental issues around antitrust and around some form of meaningful and productive protectionism of American industries, and thinking about how we can actually take care of our own people, so to speak, we're going to have the underlying conditions that lead to what just happened. And so, in a sense, maybe focusing too much on, the phenomena of Trump as opposed to what created it is somewhat of a distraction. But it's inevitable. We're going to be focused on Trump because of they're going to be focused on him 500 years from now. He would fit very well in Livy or Tacitus. I mean, people are going to be writing about him for a while.
There's a question from Liesl Gernholz about reparations and whether and how those should come into it. And obviously there's significant international experience with reparations. I'm curious, maybe Omar, if you have anything to offer on whether you think this is part of the puzzle and when and how and why. I know, Charles, you've written about reparations as well.
Am I on?
Yeah.
Yes. So I think when we speak about reckoning with the past, I think we're speaking about a variety of mechanisms by which this can be accomplished. I think Truth Commission is only one of them. We have reparations, which you already mentioned. We also have commemoration, monuments to victims, and we also have truth commissions, which I think already mentioned. The point being that we're looking at a variety of mechanisms by which we can accomplish this. On reparations, it's again a contentious issue. If you look at the cases where this has been practiced, in Argentina, for example, there was a very generous compensatory program done for the victims of the dirty war. In Spain, there was one in 2007 for the victims of the Civil War and the Franco dictatorship. I think there was a fairly modest one in South Africa, which obviously reflected the conditions of a poorer country. But it is certainly a means by which some reckoning can be done. I'm actually at the moment finishing a book on gay reparations, which looks at a variety of things that is being done in countries primarily in Europe, in Spain, Britain, and more recently Germany, but also Canada and Brazil. And I look at the ways in which this history is being exhumed in many cases, literally, and look at a variety of ways in which this can be done. It's not simply about giving money to victims. It's in many cases about restoring their dignity, which I think is worth remembering. And then one final thing, which I think brings me back to my earlier point. I agree with Jill, and of course I raised the point myself about the point of managing expectations, but there's a lot to be said for what we can get out of the Truth Commission and more broadly reckoning with the past, which I think is particularly salient to the US. And that concerns the issue of restoring, well, not restoring, basically boosting the human rights culture in this country, which is so impoverished. And it is actually a bit shocking because in fact, we were the ones who for the most part built up the human rights movement. Yet most of our movements, whether they be LGBT or even the civil rights movements, have barely been able to avail themselves to human rights rhetoric and practices, including truth commissions, primarily because for much of the Cold War, human rights were essentially deemed un-American or foreign. In fact, they were deemed a threat to American society. So I think one thing that I would look forward to, if and when we begin to incorporate things like truth commissions, is to actually boost that culture. And that culture in turn will provide social movements a language, a rhetoric, and actual strategies to bring about some change in society.
Charles, do you want to come in on the topic of reparations?
Yeah, I think morally, you can't argue with the fact that they should be paid in America. The problem is that white America doesn't want it to happen. In particular, white men don't want it to happen. And particularly wealthy white men don't want it to happen, who are the majority of Congress, still the majority of the Supreme Court, still all but one president has been a white man. There are now 4 people who are non-white who are governors in America. None of them are black, by the way. 55% of all state legislatures are white men. Another 30% are white women. 15% are the rest of us. If white men wanted it to happen, it would already be done. If they wanted gun control, it would already be done. If they wanted police reform, it would already be done. They don't want it to happen. And so all of what we do in the streets and protesting and pleading is for permission and participation, to convince or to guilt these white men into agreeing with us. That's why it doesn't happen. Should it happen, that is indisputable.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions I'm going to kind of try to put together that are really about education and what role, how much faith you would put in prospects for using education as a tool to address whether it's the legacy and reality of racial injustice or the gaps in civic education that sort of laid bare, over the last 4 years and the last 4 weeks, people who, do not understand the democratic process. And, I also think about the fact that it's incredibly contested. People have mentioned the chats, the 1619 project and the 1776 project. What are the prospects for coming together around an education agenda that could help to uproot some of this? I don't know, Jill, if you want to come in on that question, or anyone.
I can share some of that. I mean, some countries like Argentina, for example, they actually use the Truth Commission as a text in curricula. So obviously that would be a potential use for any potential Truth Commission report in the US.
Assuming there's a Truth Commission report.
Assuming though, yes.
I think it is tempting to blame a lot of ills on K through 12 education in the United States, and I've never quite understood that as much as there are profound and deep needs and inequities in K through 12 education. Public school teachers are incredibly talented and creative and hardworking, and to sort of also say on your plate is solving division in American politics is, to me, like a little bit too much to ask. I actually think the education that needs to happen is a kind of civic education that the whole country needs to be engaged in. And the way that I think about that is, the kind of crisis that Masha was talking about, the crisis of social knowledge, or the absence of knowledge, which isn't about the American past, but it's about science and everything else. It's not just it's not an accident that we don't have local papers anymore. If you go back and really pay attention to the long game that the conservative movement went out in the 1950s, it was to deliberately assault and undermine the authority of every institution in the United States that arbitrated, produced, and diffused knowledge: the universities, writers, the courts, and the press. And plan was, and it was brilliantly executed, to either replace those institutions with their own conservative media establishment, to completely undermine by assault the authority of those institutions, like the university authority of intellectuals, or to replace people in those institutions with conservatives. So the takeover of the courts, which has been extremely successful. That's a political campaign. I mean, it's not evil. It's not like a QAnon conspiracy. It was a heat political battle, and the left lost that battle. The higher education universities yielded their intellectual authority in many ways. The press, didn't defend itself well enough against that fault. This is the thing that Penn is for, to circle back to where we began, to strengthen those institutions that have been under under a concerted and sustained attack decades. The reason to sort of dethrone all those institutions as arbiters of knowledge is to say, you don't know who to trust anymore. The only people you don't trust readers, don't trust professors, don't trust reporters, don't trust people who are involved in lawyers or judges, don't trust scientists. And you get to the world we're in now. So that's not the problem K through 12 education, right? It's a political battle that involves wielding, like acquiring, achieving, and expressing political power.
I mean, I'm curious, Masha, what you say to that, sort of in light of your experience with kind of the thinkers and the intelligentsia and the writers and the journalists in Russia, and you know, that strong and yet vastly outnumbered, it seems, sort of citadel of open thought there, and how, you know, what we can learn about how to wage these battles. Is there something to be learned? You're still mute.
I always have this moment of like, oh my God, why are you asking me that question? Because, you know, everything that Russia has done, or everything that I have done in Russia, I used to like be asked, you know, how do we deal with a ruler like that? I'm like, well, you know, why are you asking me? I'm living in exile. Obviously, I don't know. So, you know, Russia has failed in everything that we would hope to do in this country. But Russia, I think that I've done a lot of writing. I've written a couple of books about sort of the function of memory in Russia, and I think one thing that that someone that I talked to for one of my books said to me that really influenced my thinking was actually about forgetting, right? And Omar was saying that there's an argument in favor of forgetting, but in order to forget, and I'm not just saying this because it sounds good, but in order to forget, you first have to remember. Right? There has to be some agreement on what it is we are forgetting, right? And I think that that's, you know, while I might agree with some arguments in favor of forgetting, I think that what we learned in Russia, and you know, I'm sure in many other countries around the world, again, it's just one that I know best, is that what happens when you start the work of forgetting before doing the work of remembering is that there's no separation sort of between past and present. There's no idea that that happened and now we're living in a, you know, collectively consciously created new reality, which is the exact opposite of what we, you know, first sort of intuitively imagine when we say, okay, well, let's just go straight into the future without dwelling on the past. It doesn't work that way. There has to be, you know, there has to be something to forget before we can allow ourselves the luxury of doing that.
Omar, do you agree with that? Do you think, like, when you talk about the, you know, the impulse to forget and the reality of forgetting in Spain, I mean, is it, you know, I guess Masha's talking about a kind of cathartic forgetting that comes after remembering. But I think part of what you're talking about is skipping right to the forgetting and then having to deal with the after effects of that, and the reckoning coming and lingering much later.
Yes, and I think with respect to forgetting, I think it's important to also remember the particular context in which forgetting is taking place. I mean, there's a world of difference between a country like Spain in the mid-70s, undergoing a transition to democracy, a transition, by the way, which was actually handled by the old regime. There was basically no room for justice and reconciliation at that particular time. That's very different than, let's say, a mature democracy like the US, which basically has no excuse for not being more forthcoming with its past. But forgetting is very complex. I think, you know, the Spaniards speak about, you know, active forgetting, which I think has a long philosophical tradition, where you somehow, much like what Masha said, you sort of reckon with the facts, you more or less agree on them, and then you decide what you want to extract. And that in many ways is what the Spaniards did in the 70s. They in essence, examined what had happened, especially during the interwar years, the death of the Second Republic, why that particular experiment with democracy did not succeed. And then if you look at the way in which the regime was recreated, in the 70s, in many ways, it actually took into account some of the errors that were made and that actually had led the country down the path of civil war. So I think I would agree with her for the most part, that forgetting, especially the type of forgetting that leads to change, that leads to an appreciation for human rights, that leads for a betterment of life, has to be somehow anchored on some realization that things did happen. But again, I go back to perhaps the very first point that I made. In the conclusion to my book, one thing that I argue is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to these problems. At the end of the day, each country, and I very much, as I said earlier, resent this idea that somehow we have to find universal solutions. And that the EU should be the one, by the way, imposing the solutions across the board. I think that in the case of Spain, which is the case that I know best, they decided what was best for them at the time. But that doesn't mean, by the way, that these things are written in stone. If you look at Spain itself, look at the law of historical memory of 2007. I mean, that law, in many cases, fell short of many people's ambitions, but it nonetheless an important marker in how the country continues to reckon with the past. Look what happened only a few months ago when they actually moved the remains of the old dictator from what used to be a national shrine, basically to fascism, and basically now can be found in an ordinary cemetery. So again, just because countries even choose to forget does not mean that the process of learning about the past somehow ceases to exist.
Okay, we are nearly out of time. I want to pose just one last question if anyone would like to comment. It's from Angela Harvey, because this is in a way the most proximate reckoning that probably is coming next. If the Senate does not convict Trump, what do you think that will mean for the power of the presidency and ultimately for the rule of law America claims to operate under? How will the Republic withstand future threats from within? I don't know, Peggy, do you have any thought on that?
I think the important fact of what will happen in the Senate in the impeachment trial will be that a great deal of gathered information, not generally known, I think, or not fully known, will be put forward and make a record and make an assertion of the terrible things that happened on January 6th and who was responsible and who was involved. And I have a feeling that is simply, obviously, just good for history. But I think it will also enter people's minds in a deeper way. I do think that when we're talking about, as Omar mentioned, when he talked about where reconciliation and truth commissions had been done, it occurred to me that during the trauma on which reconciliation was focused, those countries had not had a fully realized First Amendment reality. They had not fully absorbed everything that had happened. America in the past 5 years has had a First Amendment and plenty of talk and facts and data and argument, loads of argument. So I think that perhaps figures into the larger question that we came to talk about tonight, but I do think the headline on the impeachment will be, "This is what happened, don't forget it." I think it'll be educational.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I just would say, yes, we do have a First Amendment, but we also witness and come to grips with that First Amendment coming under, threats that I think many of us had not anticipated, and that in some cases were novel and profoundly menacing, and that's been a lot of the focus of Penn's work over the last 4 years. So I think that just bears stating. I think we're just at 9:30, so right about out of time. And I want to thank this extraordinary panel for being so clear-eyed and forthright. There's a lot to unpack here. I think some great ideas, some really challenging observations and just truths that you have all put out there for us to contemplate. So this will inform our work as an organization, and I think all of us, how we interpret the events of the coming months and years. I want to thank all of our members from across the country for joining us. I want to urge those who are not yet members to consider becoming a member and being part of these conversations. Thanks to all who participated. Thanks to the PEN America trustees and staff who helped put this together, to our chapter leaders from across the country, and especially to our extraordinary panel, Masha Gessen, Charles Blow, Peggy Noonan, Omar Encarnacion, Joe Lepore, and of course, Ayad Akhtar. Thanks everybody for being with us, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.